Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening for this presentation on the management of ADHD in educational settings. I changed the title slightly to emphasize the fact that at least here in the US, many children are out of school, sheltering at home, and are unlikely to return to school until at least later this summer, perhaps in August, if then. So it's going to be a very difficult summer for many families and educators. But I want to share with you a variety of methods that we have found to be incredibly useful in helping ADHD children succeed in educational settings. The school is the most impaired setting for ADHD children and even adults. And that is because I think it taxes their executive functions more than just about any other setting that one can think of, except perhaps the occupational setting in adults. So I want to spend just a few moments then speaking with you about the implications of these executive deficits and the view of ADHD as executive function deficit disorder. The executive functions are part of a suite of mental abilities, mainly based in the front part of the brain, that are used for self-regulation over time to accomplish goals, either goals that people have asked you to do or goals that you have determined on your own that you wish to pursue. So the executive suite, if you will, or part of the brain is a future-oriented brain-based ability. And that is that it is designed to help you think about, contemplate the future, begin to plan a series of steps that you will follow to get to that future, and monitor yourself along the way for your progress, and then if necessary, to engage in problem solving if you encounter obstacles on the way to your goals. So it's a very complex set of mind tools. I like to think of it like a Swiss Army knife of tools that we use all together in conjunction with each other in order to accomplish our goals and see to our longer term welfare. So there's very much of a social aspect to the executive system and the self-regulation that it gives to us. So there are 7 executive functions, which means there are 7 different deficits that ADHD children and adults struggle to deal with and overcome in their daily life activities. Very quickly, this involves self-monitoring and self-awareness, inhibition or self-restraint, nonverbal working memory, which is largely the use of visual imagery about the future to guide behavior. Think of it as foresight. And along with that is verbal working memory, which is the mind's voice, the ability to talk to ourselves, instruct ourselves, remind ourselves of rules and what we're doing, and using language as a form of self-guidance during our accomplishment of our goals. In addition to that, there is emotional self-regulation, which means that children with ADHD especially will be very impulsive in their emotions and not as well as other children at down-regulating strong emotions that may have been provoked by circumstances around them. Once you acquire this ability to self-regulate your emotions, it also allows you to self-motivate, which is a very important executive function for school, because in the case of ADHD, it leads to motivation deficit disorder. They simply can't motivate themselves to persist very long at activities that are not intrinsically interesting or rewarding to them, or that have no consequences associated with getting them done at that particular time. Those become very difficult for them. And of course, most schoolwork involves just those kinds of things. Working over longer periods of time in the absence of consequences and often having to do material that you may not find to be particularly rewarding or interesting to yourself. And then finally, there is the mental ability to plan and problem solve, largely based on children's play. So these are all of the executive deficits that we see in ADHD, which is why ADHD is so much more than just an attention disorder. It's a self-regulation disorder due to these problems with executive functioning. Now, we know that these deficits arise because of genetic differences between children with ADHD and others. And if they are not genetically based or inherited, a small percentage of ADHD children have acquired their ADHD because of injuries to the developing brain, most of which probably occurred during pregnancy and brain formation, but in about 5 to 10% of children can in fact occur after birth as a result of various things such as infections, closed head injury, or other things that damage the executive networks of the brain. So that is why ADHD is now thought of as a neurodevelopmental disorder. All of the known causes of ADHD fall in the realm of neurology and genetics, biology largely construed. It is not the result of social factors such as bad parenting, poor teaching, too much screen time with smart technology or computer screens, much less with things such as diet and so on. So it's very much a biologically based disorder. Now that leads to a number of things that you as educators need to keep in mind. Number one, the disorder is going to be relatively permanent for most children, although perhaps 1 out of 6 children might well recover from the disorder, but even then it will take 15 to 30 years before we will be able to see that. And there is no way of predicting who might outgrow the disorder and who does not. So we have to think of most ADHD children as having a permanent neurodevelopmental disability of the brain's executive system. What that means for you then is that you are a shepherd to a disabled child. You are not an engineer. You will not train ADHD out of these children. You will not make them like other typical children by what you do in the classroom. This is part of them, part of their brain, part of their personality, if you want to think of it that way. It's who they are. And I emphasize that because oftentimes teachers think that by what they do at school, they might be able to re-engineer and redesign the child and get them to behave like normal children. And that's simply not going to be possible. So as I explained to parents on Sunday evening, it's important that you understand your role here, that of a shepherd. Very important. Shepherds obviously have to watch over their flock and make sure that they're safe and well stimulated and nurtured and supported in various ways. And certainly that we try to train them to be better, but we don't get rid of their sheephood. We don't get them over, in this case, their ADHD. Now, although I'm going to go through a variety of educational management ideas with you today, you also need to understand that ADHD medications are more effective than the things that we will be discussing today. And the optimal treatment is to combine both approaches rather than viewing one, the behavior management principles I'll mention here, as equivalent to the medical interventions. They are not equivalent. The medications for ADHD are 2 to 3 times more effective at helping ADHD children manage their disorder and improve in school than any of the things I'm about to suggest here. But the things we're going to discuss this evening are still very important to consider, to implement with these children in order to maximize their effectiveness in school and dealing with their educational responsibilities. It's also important to understand from this executive view of ADHD that ADHD is not a problem with knowledge. It's not a problem in which ADHD children simply don't know how to behave well. And if we teach them how to behave well, such as how to get along with other children or how to organize themselves at school, that they're simply going to do that. ADHD instead is what we call a performance disorder. That means it's a problem with doing the things you already know, not in knowing what to do. Most ADHD children, unless they were adopted from some third world war-torn country and simply didn't have an opportunity to learn, most ADHD children instead know how to behave, but they can't do that. They can't use the knowledge that all other children have about what's expected of them and how to act and how to perform in school. They can't use it at critical places in school, which we call the point of performance, in order to manage their behavior better. So our job is to help them show what they know, and is not so much to teach them new ways of behaving. We will certainly do that, but no more than we would do for other children under our care who need to learn new knowledge, new skills. But don't ever assume that the problems the child with ADHD has is because they're ignorant or stupid or just don't know how to behave. They do. That's not their problem. They can't use what they know at points of performance to have more effective, successful behavior. Our job is to help them do that, show what they know, where they need to use it, when they need to use it in accomplishing their schoolwork. That's a very different approach than you would use for autism or learning disabilities, which are knowledge-based, skill deficit types of disorders. So all of this comes from the executive theory of ADHD as a disorder of self-regulation. Now, that said, I want you to remember an important rule. If ADHD is a neurodevelopmental delay, how far behind are they? On average, across most children, it's about 30% behind their age group in their executive and self-regulation abilities. So the average 10-year-old is going to behave like a typical 7-year-old when it comes to how much work they can do, how long they can do it without being supervised or rewarded. So it really has to do with the self-control. They can handle, most of them anyway, grade level work. What they can't do is grade level length assignments that they have to self-organize and self-motivate and self-monitor their performance and manage their time appropriately. Those are all executive deficits. So in working with an ADHD child, the very first thing you can do to help them is lower your expectations for their self-regulation to the appropriate age where they are likely to be, and don't expect them to behave like other children, because they can't. And a large part of the conflict teachers have with ADHD children, just like parents do, is that they expect too much for the child's executive development, and then conflict ensues between them because the child simply cannot live up to these age-appropriate expectations. But if we approach them as we do children with learning and intellectual deficits, if we approach them with the idea that they're not going to be at grade level like the other children in these mental abilities for self-control, then we will know automatically we have to lower expectations and reorganize the task in such a way that a younger child would be able to do it successfully. And that's what we're going to talk about this evening. But all of it is based on the 30% rule. Once you know that, you will have a very good idea of what you need to do to restructure the task, to add more scaffolding and assistance and artificial means to help them. and to add additional incentives and to make them more accountable to others for the work they're doing, as you would have to do for a much younger child. And then you get it. And then there's no frustration, anger, disappointment, conflict, because your expectations were too high. So lower your expectations, redesign the educational materials you want them to accomplish such that a younger child would be able to organize and sustain their action to that task, and then you'll get somewhere. Now, the executive view also tells us that ADHD involves a blindness to time. Children with ADHD don't understand time. They can't sense it, and more importantly, they can't use their sense of time in order to guide their behavior when they're asked to do tasks that have a time limit. So we have to address this time blindness through adding external reminders about time and time intervals, using cooking timers, large clocks that have a disc on them that I'll show you a picture of in a moment that shows how much time has passed and how much of the interval is left. So we need to, first of all, make sure that time is externally represented in the visual field of the child to make up for the internal clock that is not functioning well and not guiding their behavior. We also need to shorten the time intervals involved in doing tasks. And we do that, of course, by using smaller quotas of work that can be accomplished in shorter periods of time. And we will intersperse frequent breaks between those quotas. And then they can do the amount of work that other children can do. But they can't do the length of the assignment that others can do without breaking it into smaller chunks and then doing small chunks more frequently in order to address the time and timing deficits. Now, if there are large projects at school that require more than, say, 10 or 20 or 30 minutes to do, maybe they involve a week, such as a book report assigned to be done outside of school. Then we have to break those lengthy assignments into much smaller daily intervals where small quotas are done every day toward that longer term project or goal, and for which the child is going to receive immediate accountability and immediate rewards for getting the small steps done. And if we do that every day, when the time interval is finally up and the week is over, the book report is naturally done. But we can't simply assign projects that involve these huge lengths of time and expect a child with ADHD to self-organize and self-motivate and sustain action over that long of a time to accomplish the project. So we need to make sure that big projects are broken down into tiny baby steps in which we add a brick a day across this bridge to get to the other side and the goal. And then, of course, we'll also talk about what we call transition planning, another way to help them with their timing deficits. ADHD, as I've said, is going to involve a motivational deficit. They can't self-motivate when the task doesn't provide sufficient reward, interest, or other consequences for them. And yet most schoolwork involves little or no consequences, and most of it is not especially interesting to a young child. So the way we have to get around that is to inject artificial consequences into these tasks where ordinarily consequences don't occur. And of course, I'm talking about things like privileges, tokens, points, or other rewards that you can think of that a child could earn right now for getting this amount of work done. And then you compensate for not only the timing problem, but the motivational problem. So you need to think win-win. You need to think about what rewards and consequences could I put in the external environment around the child that will motivate them in order to accomplish the work I would like them to do. and then give them immediate feedback and consequences throughout the task so that they're aware of how they're doing, and you continue to motivate them with these consequences. It also means that where there is a problem getting work done, or where there is disruptive behavior in particular, the way we deal with that is not through punishment immediately. We will defer that punishment, and instead it is to work on rewarding the alternative appropriate behavior, and do that for a week or two and catch that appropriate behavior whenever it occurs, and then you will see a natural decline in the disruptive behavior. And if it doesn't decline sufficiently, then you can use swift, mild forms of punishment in order to provide consequences to deal with that. But we do not add punishment into our management methods until we have addressed the problem of rewarding the alternative appropriate behavior first. Oftentimes in school, that means paying more attention to rewarding work-related behavior and productivity, amount of problems a child is doing for us. And by increasing productivity, you automatically decrease disruptive behavior. So pay attention to that, because adults have a tendency, teachers too, to drift toward punishment as the first thing they think of when they don't like what an ADHD child is doing at the moment. And that is the wrong strategy. Punishment will come later if it is needed. Now we're going to need to use consequences that are more rewarding, salient, artificial, that you wouldn't necessarily need to offer to another child who doesn't have these motivational problems. So you're going to have to get very creative in thinking of things within the classroom, or if you're counseling parents about distance learning at home, what parents could substitute at home as rewards for getting the distance learning done in order to compensate for the motivational problem. So all of these come from understanding ADHD is an executive disorder, and one of the executive deficits is in self-motivation. Now, an additional deficit is in working memory. The mental images and the mind's talk, the mind's voice, are not effective in children with ADHD at helping guide their behavior. So it means we have to do a few things. One, offload any information about the task that we want the child to remember and know at this point. And by offload, I mean put the information on some external device or sheet of paper or sticky note or card or sign, but something physical external to the mind in the visual field that will guide the child on what the rules are for doing this particular activity or task or situation. And then we don't have to worry about their working memory for these rules and behavioral guidance. It's here where they need it for this task, and we can review it with them as they start in to the activity. So 3 things: make information and rules external, put them where the task is to be done, limit the amount of verbal information that you're giving them. In other words, act, don't yak, right? And then, if necessary, lightly touch them on the hand or arm to get their attention while you give them very brief, clear, direct instructions or feedback. So touch more, talk less, don't talk so much, and put rules in physical forms around the child. So lastly, we need to know that the planning part of the brain, which involves holding information and mentally manipulating that information, as you would do when mental arithmetic has to be done, pieces of these problems need to be made real and physical through some external props or other means that the child can manipulate with their hands, not just with their mind, in order to solve the problem. In the case of arithmetic, it might be something like a number line. some marbles to count, an abacus that they could have to move the discs around in order to add, subtract, or do the other arithmetic operations they need to do. But problem solving has to be partly manualized and externalized to compensate for the mental problem solving deficit. Now, I said that self-awareness is one of the executive deficits. How can we compensate for that? Well, people haven't really studied that an awful lot, but a few things that have been tried that work well are things like videotape self-modeling. What does that mean? It means that when the child is working well, or maybe when they're having a problem, you take out your smartphone, you go to the photography button, you press the one for video, and you film them for a few minutes while they're working. And then later, perhaps a few minutes or shortly thereafter, the two of you can sit down, replay the video, talk about how they behaved, what they did right, what they were not doing so well at, and then suggest alternative behaviors they could have done. Children like seeing themselves in these sorts of movies. We've done this for autism. I think it would work well for ADHD children as well. And it would help them with self-monitoring and self-awareness. Another thing is to cue them to stop periodically and to report what they are doing. So it can simply be where you stop them and say, Ethan, tell me what you're doing right now. And they give you a report, a little checkup, so that you continue to surprise them with these little checkups throughout the day where they have to report on themselves and what they're up to. For very young children, you can use the word turtle, which means act like a turtle. When I say the word, pull in your arms and legs, stop what you're doing, look around the classroom or the learning setting, and ask yourself, what should I be doing now? Where am I supposed to be? And that's a great little one-word cue when it looks like ADHD children are drifting off task, becoming silly or disruptive, or simply mind-wandering and not working. You just say turtle, and you've taught them what that means. You can use other ways to cue them as well, including nonverbal cues. You could have 2 eyes or 2 ears mounted on a tongue depressor or a popsicle stick so that you've got these images that you've cut out of magazines or gotten off the internet, and all you have to do is lift the popsicle stick, and there's a little cue to stop and look and listen at what you're supposed to be doing. For older children, we'll talk in a moment about daily behavior report cards that you use to evaluate them, but that they eventually can use to evaluate themselves. Now, another executive deficit I've mentioned that may need some attention in school is poor emotion regulation. Here again, very little work has been done on how to improve this in classroom settings. You could use video self-modeling again when a child appears to be getting upset, or alternatively, when they're getting along well with others and are in a very good mood. You can video them doing both of these things, and then review these videos with them to teach them better strategies for emotion regulation, or to reward and approve of the good control that they've been showing at other times that you videotape them. Again, you can use cued de-escalation, a little cue of some way to help the child chill out. Maybe it's a picture of an ice cube, but some way that the child gets the cue that they need to stop for a moment, calm down, breathe, and regain control, because it looks like they're getting a little frustrated or upset with what has happened or the work you're asking them to do. If they get too much out of control, then the emotional brain overwhelms the executive rational brain, and now no teaching is going to be possible until they calm down again. So then you're going to have a location in your classroom or at home, these days of distance learning, where the child can go, chill out, regain emotional control. It's kind of like a timeout, but it's not meant to be punitive. It's meant simply to pause the action and have the child remove themselves from the situation to calm down, maybe meditate, deep breathe, and learn other ways to self-soothe, and then they can return back to the teaching situation or the task again. Some people think that social skills training teaches this. It doesn't teach it very well, and we've learned that social skills training does not work very well for ADHD children. That is because it's trying to teach knowledge. It's not rewarding the child for using that knowledge with other children that they have to get along with on a daily basis. Usually social skills training is traditionally done in a group setting somewhere else in the school with other children from other classes that this child may or may not know, and there's no effort to generalize it back to the normal classroom ecology. So I think those are reasons why it has failed so far. But try some of these other strategies. Now we're going to quickly go through a variety of other suggestions that you can use to improve classroom performance and educational management. Some of these I don't even need to explain to you. They're self-evident, self-explanatory. So on each slide, I'm going to pull out just a few of the things that I think do require some clarification. Otherwise, you should have been provided or will shortly be provided with my slides to serve as a handout for this evening's program, and you'll have the information there. Now, no one expects you to do all of the things we're going to talk about. You should think of this like a restaurant with a menu that's a buffet, and you can go down the menu and choose a la carte items that are needed for one particular child, whereas others might do better for another type of child. I'm just going to throw out about 80 different suggestions here on these slides that you can think about to help with a particular child with ADHD. One we've already mentioned: work on productivity. Reward number of problems attempted, and don't worry about grading the problem for accuracy just yet. The problem most ADHD children have is with production, not accuracy. So for a while, maybe a few days or longer, put aside grading the papers and watch how many problems they attempt and reward them for each problem attempted or for small quotas of work that they're doing. And then once productivity has increased through these reinforcement programs, we can come back and grade the paper and talk about the ones that are wrong and why they're wrong, and the usual approach you take to children's classroom desk work and productivity. I mentioned cutting down the workload, using smaller quotas, taking frequent breaks. Movement is very good for children with ADHD. We want them exercising a lot, moving while they're working, maybe even squeezing a tennis ball or a rubber toy, or tapping their feet, or maybe they have a little bar that swings under their desk and they can put their feet on it and move while they're working. All of this involves movement, and we know that even small amounts of movement increase attention and productivity in ADHD children. By the way, that's another reason you should never keep them in class during recess. They, more than other children, need to get out and move. To keep an ADHD child in from recess is to shoot yourself in the foot. You're making their disorder worse, not better. So please don't do that. The more movement, the better. And one way of doing that is that if you have to teach things to them, you can have them come up to the front of the class with you and you involve them in the teaching itself. Maybe they hold a pointer and point at words in a poem, or maybe they have the chalk and they're writing down the math problem while you're describing the problem. But in various ways, try to incorporate them into the lesson, allowing them to move and be a part of the teaching rather than to sit passively in front of you and merely be a recipient of your teaching, because they're not going to pay much attention to you for very long, only minutes at a time, and then you're going to lose their attention. If they participate, they don't. Where possible, and you want them to practice fluency and skills drills, incorporate computers and learning software, apps, and maybe websites like Khan Academy that already have all classes that children take in school for traditional subjects already programmed using a behavioral program learning format in order to engage children and to teach them basic academic subjects. So supplement your lectures with online learning and programmed instruction that includes a lot of rewards for learning as the child goes through the task. And then, as I've said, frequent breaks as well. Now, when it comes to the way you instruct, being more animated and theatrical is better. Think about Robin Williams in the Dead Poets Society and how theatrical and animated he was in order to keep his students' attention. You need to stop periodically and dispense frequent praise to the children who are listening and behaving, occasional reprimands or punishment for the children who are not, and maybe repeating your instructions or having the children repeat back the instructions for the activity that they're supposed to be involved in. We've talked about self-monitoring already. Another thing is to try not to reward impulsiveness. Don't make the classroom like a game show where the winner is the child who gets their hand up and blurts out the answer first. We want every child to have a chance to answer. And then we can talk about the correct answer. One way to do this is that every child gets a piece of cardboard that's laminated and it's white, and they have a grease pencil, and they get to write the answer on, and every child has one, and they can hold up their little workboard, and then you don't call on somebody until nearly everybody has their hand up, and you can look up and down the rows to see what the answers are. You need to know how every child is doing and not just reward the ones who get the answers first. The ADHD child is probably going to raise their hand, even not knowing the answer, because they want to be included in this too. But you're only rewarding impulsiveness instead of contemplation and problem solving. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that ADHD children lose their powers of attention and motivation as the day progresses. And although we all do, so do typical children, the slope of the decline in children with ADHD is dramatic. This is why many of the medications that we use have had to be reformulated so that the afternoon portion of the extended release medication has more medicine, a higher dose, than the morning part that's releasing earlier in the day. And that's to compensate for this marked decline in attention, motivation, and even just alertness and arousal across the day. One way to help compensate for this decline is to alternate fun with boring, with fun and boring activities, keeping each one relatively brief so that the child can see when they're doing the more boring extended work that it's not going to last long, and then we're going to do something very interesting that I like, and then I'll have to do a little work. All of us find that tedious work is much easier to do when we break it into small chunks and alternate it with short periods of fun activity or things that interest us, and then we go back to do our work again. So make sure that you alternate activities, high and low appeal. Try to get the more difficult activities or tasks into the morning hours rather than the afternoon hours when we want more fun things for them to do. Now, another way to maintain a child's attention and interest is to require that they always be taking notes while you might be lecturing about an idea, a concept, or something they need to learn. You need to keep your lectures very brief, get to the point when you can, but when you're teaching, everybody's pencil should be in their hand and it should be moving on a sheet of paper. Nobody should be sitting there with their hands in their lap staring. That's a cadaver. That's what dead people do. And we don't want ADHD children, or even any child, to act like a dead person. What were you thinking? You want a classroom of cadavers. We don't. We want a classroom of active learners who, while they attend, are moving, taking notes, listening, and we can judge that they're engaged by the fact that their hands are taking notes. These can be simple notes, short phrases, single words, little diagrams, hieroglyphs, anything the child wants that helps them remember what you're talking about. And then they can even draw little lines if there's a sequence that they have to learn the information in. All of these are strategies for active online engagement of children during lecturings or when they have things to read or movies to watch for educational purposes. All of these, the individual should be engaged in active movement with note-taking. Now, ADHD involves a deficit in working memory. This, over time, is going to create an ever greater problem with reading comprehension. You can't comprehend anything that you read or see or hear if you can't hold it in mind. And that's what working memory is, actively holding mental information online so that we can understand it better, manipulate it, sequence it, understand the plot of a story or the way a math problem should be done. They can't do that. So 40 years ago, the SQ4R system was invented to help with reading comprehension. And it simply involves these words that represent the acronym of SQ4R. Number one, survey the material you have to learn very quickly. Two, have a set of very simple questions you have to answer about this material. Three, read a paragraph. Say out loud what was in the paragraph that's important, right? So recite it. Write down what you just said. Review what you just wrote. So there's 4 different reviews of the paragraph and its important elements taking place every paragraph. Read, recite, write, review. Next paragraph. And we will work our way step by step through the reading material. And all of this will vastly improve comprehension for ADHD children. But don't just ask them to read because they'll forget what they're reading, back to the top of the page, read a little bit, forget, read, forget, and they have to read the page 7 times over in order to get out of that what other children got on the first reading. So this is why comprehension is so difficult for them. There are various organizational systems I'm sure you're well aware of, being educators, that you can get to help them stay organized at their desk or at their homework station at home, from color-coded binders and trapper keepers and organizing systems. So we're not going to go over that. Any office supply store will have those kinds of things. If necessary, offer after-school tutoring or help if the child is falling behind, or encourage that they be tutored outside of school if parents have the financial means to do that as well. You can also supplement, as you would with LD children, through books on tape or other large printed curriculum materials, maybe videos from the library or on the internet or at the public television that they can review in order to back up the education that you're trying to give them on a particular subject. All of these are ways of providing extra assistance to the child to keep them moving along in school. ADHD, because it is a motor disorder, disrupts handwriting and causes motor incoordination for many children. So while we do need to teach them to print and do cursive writing, we also need to give them an alternative means of expressing themselves. And these days, with computers being as ubiquitous as they are, we can do keyboarding training very early in the lives if they haven't learned it already at home, even as preschoolers. Now, you can also write behavior contracts for children where they agree and sign a contract to get certain work done on that particular day, and they get to earn a reward for doing that. Another way of getting their attention and keeping them interested in the task is to have other children teach them, and then they get to teach the other child, and they alternate peer tutoring of the material that you're asking them to learn. And you can read about peer tutoring on the slide. It's very straightforward, easy to learn, but children pay attention to other children much more than they pay attention to adults. So use that to your advantage and have children teaching and coaching each other and also working in groups if necessary. And you will find that the child with ADHD is more attentive and is more productive. I've already mentioned the need for external, salient, powerful rewards to be artificially inserted into tasks to motivate the child with ADHD. No need to go back over that again. But we need to be sure that they're getting frequent rewards, points, and tokens throughout the day for the work that they're doing, and then that they have multiple times a day that they can cash in their consequences and points in order to earn privileges at school. Only after about third or fourth grade should you be thinking of using a daily behavior report card where you provide a rating on the card and that gets converted to a point system when they get home. For older children, they can handle that delay because partly they've gotten some feedback from you on how they've done. But very young children cannot handle the delay to getting home and being rewarded for what they did hours earlier in school. So you have to wait for maturation of the brain to kick in order for them to be able to manage those kinds of delays. Now, sometimes we do need to take away points as a form of punishment or use timeout. Where that is the case, make sure that you're always providing twice as many rewards for positive behavior that you are removing for negative behavior. Because if you don't, the child will lose all their rewards, they will go into the hole or into debt, and the reward program won't be an incentive anymore, and they won't care. So don't punish too much within these reward systems like point systems. I've mentioned using teams of children to work together as another means of keeping the ADHD child on task. You can also create frequent reminders during a particular lesson or activity to stay on task and keep working. And we've done this previously by creating recordings of these variable intervals of tones, like a bell ringing, or a buzzer sounding, or a piano key being struck, whatever noise or tone you want to use. It's simply that it has to be random. And then you can play this tape or this recording while they're doing certain kinds of desk work. And you tell them that when you hear the bell or the buzzer, they are to stop and give themselves a point if they were working, or take away a point if they were off task. And then the children dispense the points to themselves following those rules. At the end of the task, they can cash in the points that they earned. But it's like a slot machine. They never know when the buzzer sounds or when the bell rings, and therefore they will always keep working because the reward is unpredictable. And the best way when you're faced with a variable reward schedule is to always do the work. That's why gambling is so addictive to people, because it's a variable payoff for the behavior of gambling. So that's another thing that you can do. As I've mentioned, you can also use what we call home-based reports or behavior report cards at school. And these sort of report cards have the goals and the behaviors you want them to do in that task or that subject matter. And then you're going to give them feedback and a number, a rating for how they're doing. And then this is going to go home daily to the parents, so that parents have frequent feedback of how their child is behaving. The parents can then link up these ratings with consequences at home, such as points that the child can earn and then spend on their household privileges. It's also a way of inviting parents to collaborate and cooperate and communicate with you through these cards as well. Let me show you one of these cards. This is one that we created, and you can print them up by the hundreds. The child is given this card every morning, either by the parent or better yet, by the first period teacher. And the child is to take this to every teacher. There's 7 columns, so that up to 7 class periods and 7 teachers can fill out this evaluation, depending upon how the school day is broken down. And in each period of the day, that teacher rates the child using the numbers at the top of the card. And they go down the rules on the left, and they evaluate the child for how well they've behaved using the numbers 1 to 5. And then they initial it to ensure that the card is not a forgery. And then the child takes this card across the day to every teacher and for every subject and is getting frequently evaluated for how well they're doing that day. At the end of the day, the card goes home. The parents are going to assign points for every number. You'll see those points in parentheses. Some of the points are good, they're pluses, and some of them are bad. So they're negative, they're punitive, they're fines, and they're minuses. The parents add up the positives, subtract the fines, and what is left is what the child has to spend for their privileges that day at home. But remember, children have to be at least 8 or 9 years of age or older in order to handle the delay to the reward at home. For younger children, you're better off doing the reward program in the class frequently as they go. Now, many teachers are what I call reactive teachers, which simply means that they teach until a problem occurs and then they stop and try to deal with the problem. You're reacting to the child, not being proactive with this child. So we want you to be using not just reactive strategies like rewards and punishment and consequences, but proactive strategies that help to set up a situation and prepare the child for the situation, and in that manner, reduce and head off the likelihood of a problem even happening to begin with. And we call this transition planning. So before you go into any new activity with a child, when they arrive at your class, or when they go from one activity to another within your class, you are to stop, and before the activity begins, go over 2 or 3 rules with them, have the child repeat them, maybe have them written on a card already that you hand to the child to read, and then you review the consequences they can earn for following these rules in this upcoming activity with you. Then you will explain the punishment, what you will lose, usually it's points, if you misbehave while we're doing this activity. And then you give the child something active to do. We've already talked about the value of activity for ADHD children. And then you start the situation, you're monitoring your plan, and you're giving them frequent rewards and feedback during the activity, not waiting till the end, but throughout the activity, and then at the end, we can evaluate how you've done. If you do this between every major transition in school, or if parents do this during transitions at home, you can cut your problems by 50 to 60% or more. So let's be both proactive and reactive. I've mentioned that working memory is very poor. So what does that mean? It means that you have to make rules and consequences external. So rules have to be written down, and we've talked about various ways to do that, and you can see that on the slide. We also have to make time physical, and I've already talked about that. Here's a clock you can buy on the internet to use for desk work that can be programmed for up to an hour, and the red disc disappears as the work is being done. And that way the child can be reminded of the time they've spent and the time left and stay on task accordingly. Sometimes you will have to use punishment. Schools differ in the kinds of punishment they allow teachers to institute, so I can't go over with you anything necessarily very specific. There's a variety of disciplinary tactics, from losing points to reprimands to timeouts to writing moral essays of why you won't do this again. Schools, like I said, have their own policies. But there are a couple of things that I want you to be aware of that makes punishment effective. Number one, there must be lots of rewards in the teaching situation before removal from that situation is punitive, is a teaching moment. If there's not a lot of reward in school, children are happy to spend time in timeout daydreaming instead. So make sure that you are rewarding active learning with lots of rewards and fun activities and high appeal activities, and then removal from your classroom is punitive, aversive. Second, when you're going to punish, make sure that you provide very swift, mild consequences, not lengthy, painful consequences. They can be very brief. Timeouts can be just a few minutes. When they're done swiftly, in a classroom with a lot of rewards that the child can earn, they're effective. But if you have found that punishment doesn't work for a child, look at those two rules and you'll know why. You either don't have a very rewarding classroom, you're not providing lots of incentives for good, engaging behavior, and the second thing is that you're talking too much. You're reminding, you're threatening, you're nattering, and therefore you're not acting quickly within 7 to 10 seconds to provide consequences for disruptive or inappropriate behavior. Now, if you're going to do timeout, think about using what we call do a task rather than traditional timeout where the child has nothing to do while they're sitting in a corner and having been removed from the classroom. The do a task is explained right here. It's very easy to do, but it involves active task performance while seated at the timeout location. And the teacher simply says how many worksheets you have to do in timeout. The child determines how long the timeout lasts by how many worksheets they get done and how quickly they do it. And then they return back to their normal desk and put their worksheets on your desk. But active behavior during a timeout is far better for ADHD children than is simply sitting passively and trying to pass the time accordingly. Now, another thing that you can try, particularly for temper outbursts or disruptive behavior, is take out your smartphone, threaten that you're going to videotape it, and you're instantly going to email it to mom or dad or a relative this child finds very important in their life. There is nothing like a video to stop a tantrum dead in its tracks. No children like their anger recorded. But you have to do it early in the temper sequence, and you have to do it quickly. But I can just tell you, even threatening and warning children that you will do this is often sufficient to keep temper outbursts down. But you'll find that it only takes one of those for the child to learn that lesson. So there are other things you can do here as well. I've given you some keys to timeout. We don't need to go through those, but have a look at those. Now, lastly, I just want to mention a few things to do for adolescents that you happen to be teaching. There are 4 things that we consider to be the most effective things to try with a teenager. You can try all the other things that I've talked about. They work too. But in particular for teenagers, because their day involves a lot of self-organizing. There's lots of changing of classes. They have to remember lots of assignments. They have lockers. They have to know how to organize their lockers and their materials for the upcoming day. There's just a lot more self-regulation and self-organization required of an adolescent at middle school or high school. So number 1, if they're not on medication, think about getting them on medication and talk to their families about that. That can help them to maintain and control their ADHD across the day. Number 2, let's find someone at school who will give us 15 minutes today. We're going to break that into 3 5-minute checkups. The teen enters the school, goes to their coach. Their coach meets with them for 5 minutes, looks to see that they have their homework, looks to see that they've got the books that they need for the upcoming next few hours, gives them a daily report card that they're going to take to each teacher to be evaluated, and then gives them a little bit of a pep talk. This is supposed to be positive and encouraging coaching, not negative and threatening and a disciplinary encounter. And then the teen checks back with you at midday for another 5-minute checkup, and then again at the end of the day before they leave school. We need frequent accountability across the day for organizing themselves, getting their work done, looking at the ratings on how they're behaving from their teachers, and then organizing them to leave school. And if you'll do that, they won't fall between the cracks over the next 6 weeks, and only then do we find out they're not doing well, and then we try to make up for it. It's too late. They're too far behind. So accountability every day for what they need to do is one of the best things you can do. So to repeat, right? We need medication if necessary, a coach to keep them accountable, a daily behavior report card for accountability to all the teachers, and an assignment sheet for their assignments. The back of the card can do that. All of the rest of this is simply things that you can incorporate into your teaching with a teen, and we've covered all of that. Now, I've given you a couple of slides to look at about distance teaching from your classroom or from your home over to the child's home. Maybe they're sheltering in as we are here in Virginia, and children are not in school. This is a very difficult time for children, for their parents, many of whom have work to do at home, not just teaching their children what you want them to do. So the first thing I want you to know is that our National Organization for ADHD has created 38 different handouts for working with children and adults with ADHD at home during this pandemic. Please go to that website. You're going to see lots and lots of useful information about that. The second thing is stop pretending that the times are normal. They're unprecedented, they're historic, we're all anxious, we're all a little worried, we're concerned about how we're going to come out of this, and it's okay to share that. Children know that anyway. They see how their parents and others are reacting. But we can acknowledge the uncertainty while providing reassurance to them that we know what we're doing and we will get through this together as teachers and students or as family members. Also ask children how they think the work might be broken up better for them, for their home, for their parents' activities. Don't just come in as a top-down expert that thinks you know everything about teaching a particular child. That child and their parents are the experts about them. You're a generalist. You have strategies. The two of you can collaborate on what things might help a particular child. And sometimes children come up with some pretty clever ways of breaking their work down and scheduling it at different times of the day in order to get it done. And when a child helps to solve a problem, they're much more likely to engage that task than if they're simply told all day long, this is what you do, this is when you do it. So engage them in collaborative problem solving and learning, and you might learn something from these kids on what to help and pass along to other families you're counseling. Right? Also remember, if you're trying to lecture as I am now, using Zoom or the internet to do so, you're not all that interesting. You're not a video game. You weren't designed like a video game or an app to be rewarding or interesting. Please keep that in mind and keep these lectures and contacts with children via video short. I would rather have them doing more through online learning that was programmed to be interesting, such as at Khan Academy, than I would have you lecturing. Also, see if you can find ways to incorporate the flow of daily life in their home in order to teach some of the material that's part of your lesson plan. So that could be simply what we call kitchen science or backyard science or other things that they can do in order to learn while they're sheltering, but it isn't going to be formal, sitting down, filling out paperwork in order to do the lesson that you've given them to do. There are alternative ways to make it more interesting, and parents perhaps can suggest some things to you. You tell them the concept you'd like the child to work on that day. They are the ones who can try to find ways that day to incorporate that learning into family life. But let's understand it. Children are not going to make the progress when they're sheltering at home that they would have made in your classroom. It's just not going to happen. That's okay. There may be some regression or some failure to learn as quickly as they might have. My response to that is, so what? These are historic times. Children are like sponges. They're rapid learners. They will catch up with the material that they may not have acquired during the sheltering at home and home learning. So let's not get all neurotic and OCD about the curriculum, your lesson plan, how much progress we've made through it or not. You're not going to make that kind of progress, but that's okay. We'll catch up when we get returned to school after the sheltering at home is over, and we can go back over concepts. You're going to have to do that anyway because your students are going to be at all kinds of different places and have made different progress in their distance learning when they were sheltering at home. So let's put off some of this until then, when the children can come back to us and we can catch them back up again. Remember, when you're working with parents at home, you're more like a life coach to a parent than you are a teacher, because the parent is the one that has to do your job for you. And parents are not good at this. They're not trained like a teacher in pedagogy and ways of engaging children. So let's understand part of our job is encouraging parents, giving them some suggestions, listening to their concerns, redesigning the learning for that particular home environment, and then letting some of it go and letting them have some time together as a family, or if the parents have work to do. So that said, I hope that you've learned a great deal from this lecture about distance learning, but also about when children return to school, how to manage ADHD in school, and to keep in mind it is a neurodevelopmental disorder of executive functioning and self-regulation that is going to persist over time. And if you'll understand that, you'll understand you're trying to teach a disabled student, and that you're going to have compassion and a willingness to make modifications and exceptions in your curriculum for helping to educate this student while they're with you. Thank you very much, Iris. I hope that you've all learned a great deal from the lecture. Let me get out of my slides and stop sharing my screen. And let's see if we have a few questions. First question has to do with whether or not I've heard of the parental occupational executive training that perhaps physical or occupational therapists may have developed. No, I have not. I can tell you I review all published research in the world every week in order to keep my own presentations and slides and newsletter up to date. I have seen no randomized scientific studies of this particular intervention. So all that means is that a lot of people have developed various tactics and methods and training out there from their own experience or that of others, and then they recommend it to people, but it doesn't necessarily rise to the level of being tested in an organized or systematic way in research. At this point, I can simply tell you I've seen no evidence for the usefulness of that kind of approach. It doesn't mean it isn't, it just means we don't know. But it could be good, it may not be good, but I can tell you this, if all it does is teach learning and skills, and it does not get implemented in the natural ecology of that child, where the problems are occurring with executive functioning, then it's going to have no generalization and no maintenance, and it won't be effective. We already know that from lots of other treatments that tried to do skill training that were knowledge-based, that took place away from the normal classroom or the natural flow of normal activity, and therefore failed to do anything to help that child where it really matters in their natural life in that class with other children. So one can very quickly evaluate whether such a program could ever work based on those criteria alone, the executive model of ADHD. Now, the next question has to do with how can teachers set up larger projects to be done in smaller tasks when they don't do it for the other children? Well, the first thing to think about is, why not do it for the other children? Why are we doing all of these week and 2 week and 3 week long projects, which, by the way, the parents are now going to have to break down into little tiny steps every day instead of you doing that as part of the school day? So somebody has to break this down for the ADHD child, because they're not going to do a 2 week project self-organized on their own and self-motivated with no assistance. So number one is, let's think about whether or not we're assigning projects that take too long to be done on their own, even for typical children. The second thing is to remember what I mentioned at the beginning. This is a disability. We make accommodations for disabled people. We don't expect them to do what the other children do and do it in the way other kids do and only in the way I teach those other children. If that were the case, there would be no ramps coming into our office buildings or other facilities for physically disabled people. There'd be no prosthetic limbs. There'd be no hearing aids, no braille, because after all, why should we do it for them when we don't do it for typical people? And the answer is they're disabled. That's why we do it. Recognizing ADHD as a hidden executive disability should bring out a compassion and willingness to make accommodations that we don't make for other non-disabled people. That's what we do, right? So keep that in mind. Otherwise, it becomes almost ridiculous to say that we're not doing special things for disabilities because we don't do them for the other individuals. And hopefully that'll help you think through this idea that sometimes we make accommodations for special children in our classrooms that we don't necessarily do for other children. Don't worry about stigmatizing. It rarely happens when you do these special accommodations. And by the way, other children are earning privileges too. You've just got them on a delay to the natural consequences you ordinarily use in your classroom. We're just asking you to short circuit that delay and bring those consequences up earlier, more often, maybe artificially, but everybody's earning consequences. It's the delay, however, that the ADHD child can't tolerate. So all of that said, our time is just about up here. I want to thank Iris, you again, Lines and Thoughts, the other sponsors you mentioned at the opening of today's program for helping to sponsor this particular webinar. I want to thank everybody who signed on. More than 100 people have attended this lecture. That is wonderful, reassuring, very encouraging, and also something for which I am eternally grateful that people are this interested in learning about how to help people with ADHD. So good evening, everybody. Good luck during this pandemic, and hopefully I'll have a chance to come back to Israel again sometime in the future to teach. Bye-bye, Iris. Good day,
Thank
everybody.
you so much. Bye.
You're welcome.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.